My Govanen, good to see you in Sindarin. I am the Tolkien Shirt, and I have seen the third episode of The Rings of Power. While I was watching it, I felt like I was being deceived on every step of the way. Like I was receiving a gift wrapped in beautiful music, admirable visuals, and signed with even greater name, but containing nothing of worth, nothing of meaning, and nothing of substance. So today, on the example of the third episode of this show, we will learn how to write an unlikable protagonist, how to resolve plot problems with contradictions, how to tell and don't show, how to make death meaningless, and how to have no respect for the source material. Warning, as always, spoilers ahead. So the episode presents 3 storylines. We'll get with them one by one. The first one is Nori's storyline, and it is the shortest. So we see the hobbits celebrating. There is a festival, and at the same time Largo, Nori's father, who twisted his ankle and cannot celebrate, talks to his wife, and basically she is worrying that they will be left behind, for he cannot catch up with the others during the upcoming migration, and he is certain that all will be alright. They'll go at the beginning of the convoy, so they'll be not left behind, and they are accompanied by the hobbits' chant, "Nobody walks alone." We'll see about that later. And later they talk about Nori. We get another great piece of exposition by telling and not showing that nothing will stop Nori. And then we cut to Nori herself. She is stealing a page from Sadok's book, and after some troubles she manages to get that page with the constellation that the stranger showed her. And then all hobbits gather for Sadok's speech, and at that time the stranger shows up and finds the page that Nori has hidden. And then when all hobbits are near, he comes close to the fire and tries to read it, and the page catches fire. In the mess that follows, the stranger falls between the hobbits, and then when they are all terrified, he calls Nori's name. So the whole adventure of Nori is now revealed. Then we learn that the punishment for meeting the stranger and going away from the camp is being left behind. So that's for this chant, "Nobody walks alone." The hobbits seem eager to leave their own behind, just for helping somebody. I never thought I would see hobbits so cruel, but this is the day. Fortunately, Sadok rushes in and tells that Nori is still young, so the punishment cannot be so harsh. So instead, she'll go with them, but at the back of the convoy. So it means that not only Nori will be left behind, but all her family, if they are to travel with their father, who cannot push the cart, who is unable to migrate. As we see in a scene later, they indeed stay behind, and nobody tries to help them. They would be left behind if not for the stranger that helps them. They would be left behind. That's a change to the hobbits that I cannot believe that I see. They are cruel, they don't care about their own, and for the rules they are able to see them dead, leave them unattended, leave them to die. So that's hobbits in this episode. So now we move to Arondir's storyline. We see him being dragged by the orcs to be joined with other captives. We learn that among the orcs there is someone that they very much respect. They call him Adar. And then Arondir is joined with other captives, and among them there are elves, his companions, who we have seen in the Elven Tower. How did they get there? How were they captured? How was the whole company beaten and enslaved? We never learn. Then we get some short and basic exposition that orcs can't stand the sun, even though they dig on the surface, and we have seen them digging underground. And then we move to a more poorly written exposition, because two of the elves discuss what is the purpose of the orcs. And they conclude that it is finding something, perhaps a weapon. I wonder what that could be. But there are some more interesting questions. How do the elves know that? What clues did they use to reach the conclusion? Which orcs did they overhear? What actions did they see? And finally, how can the viewer reach the same conclusion? We get answer to none of the above. It is not just poorly executed exposition, but something that the characters are not supposed to know. Such was the case with Galadriel in the first episode, when she knew every secret of the fortress that she has just discovered, so well as if she had built it herself. Then we move to an interesting question. Arondir asks, why do the orcs call their leader, Adar, by an elven name? I wanted to know the answer. I asked the question earlier, but we do not get an answer, not a straight one, but very convoluted. For the answer is Sauron in his time had many names. But it is not an answer to that question. Setting aside the fact that the elves are said in the prologue of the show to think of Sauron as someone that has gone, that is no longer in Middle-earth, that is forgotten, and now that they immediately assume that it is him that leads the orcs. But the answer that it is one of his names, it's not an answer to the question why it's an elven name, and why do orcs, who have their names for their leaders, for places, very different than the elves, use an elven name. Maybe we'll get an answer, but it was not provided here. And then the elves discuss the plans of escape. They know that they must find help and bring here other elves to save them, and all others who were enslaved. For there are not only elves but many people of the Southlands. And to execute the escape plan, they want to have a look at the surroundings. So then, the leader of the elves has just explained a silent escape plan, who emphasized how important it is to at least one of them to survive. Decides to provoke all orcs that he sees for a sake of a tree. You see, a tree stands in the way of the workers who cannot dig further, and the elf decides that he will not cut it down. The orcs, provoked, kill one of the elves. Great job, leader, at keeping your men alive and ready to help the others. But there's more to this scene. You see, it is play out as a very grievous moment. It reminds me of Boromir's death in the Fellowship of the Ring. We have the same elements, sad music. The scene is shot in slow motion. We get last words of the dying elf. We see expression of his companions. But there is one major difference between those two scenes. In the Fellowship of the Ring, we got to know Boromir. We learned who he is, what he meant to the story. His death has its consequences even in the third part of the trilogy. We had known him, we learned about his vices and about his honor in the last hour. And the death meant something. Here, we know nothing about this elf. Here, his death is meaningless. I invite you to try to remind yourself, what was his name? I didn't remember that when I was watching the scene, and I did not care about him, but the show tried to sell it as something such as great as Boromir's death. It brings to our attention another problem with some basic writing competence. Here, it is setup and payoff. Setup is a preparation, investment that you make, investment of viewers' time, thoughts, and feelings. And payoff is using this investment to achieve something greater, a moment of great emotion, a moment of contemplation, a moment of catharsis. Good payoff makes use of what was set up later, but here the writers of the show want to have this great emotional payoff without any setup. No, at the end of the scene, Arondir decides to cut down the tree. We are reminded that the whole feud was about a tree, and it's again played out as something great, noble. Arondir decides to cut it down. The music tries its hardest, but again, I cared the same for the tree as I cared for an elf, because I don't know the tree, I didn't know the elf, and they both have no meaning to the story. Arondir gets a look around and cuts down the tree. So basically, he achieved his leader's purpose and got a look at the surroundings, but at what cost? Couldn't they just cut the tree and doing that, see what was around? It would be the same and wouldn't require death. But what do we see? It's that the orcs, their slaves, have dug a great trench spreading across the land in a straight line. Again, I would like to remind you that they are looking for something, so why do they dig in a straight line? And they are hiding they want to avoid the people that live there, the wardens that watched over this land for hundreds of years. And yet they are clearly visible in this country. You cannot miss them, and the noise that they make, and the people that they capture. How was it not noticed? How blind you have to be to miss those orcs and what they are doing. Then, in the final scenes, we see the captives rebel against the orcs. I like the fact that they use sun to fight the orcs, but that's the most praise I can give to this chain of events. And there are some deep problems with it, especially the fact that most of the fighters that take part in it disappear. As you can see here, the elves and other captives are in a strong number. There is almost a dozen of them struggling against the orcs, but later we see only 2 of them die. One escapes but is shot down by the orcs. It's the elven leader, and Arondir is captured. But what happened to the others? Where did they go? What have they done? Why didn't they take part in the fight? They're just forgotten. Then used their... It's a serious problem, and the show doesn't address this issue. But the final outcome of the battle is that some are killed, but Arondir is captured, and orcs didn't show mercy to the others, to those that we have seen. But Arondir is spared. We don't know why. We just know that he is to be brought before the face of Ada. And then, in the final scene of this episode, we see Ada himself, but through a misty screen, so we do not really see his face. There is only a silhouette. We get to see that it is not very Sauron looking, as we know it's from Peter Jackson's movies, it's from the prologue to this show, but someone looking closer to a man or an elf. We will learn if it is really Sauron that hides behind his name. Now we are left with Galadriel. She wakes up on a ship, a Numenorian ship, whose captain is Elendil. He tells her that he's obliged to take her to his betters. We'll see about that. And we get some exposition provided by Galadriel to seemingly uneducated Halbrand. She explains to him that Numenor was granted to the men that fought against Morgoth in the war, that Numenor was granted to them as a gift from the Valar. And that in the days of old there was friendship between elves and humans from the island, but it is long gone, and Galadriel tells us that we'll learn what caused it. We do not learn that in this episode, though, but Galadriel and Halbrand are brought before the Queen Regent Muriel and her advisors, and we learn that any elf is forbidden to enter the lands of Numenor, which clearly contradicts the words of Elendil, who told Galadriel that he is obliged to take her to Numenor. And then we learn even more about Galadriel's lovely character. She's pretentious, demanding what's not hers. She tells Numenorians that they were granted the Isle because of the elves, which stays in contradiction to what she said before. And she says that she is answered that the Menorians fought for the island with blood. They earned it with their blood. So Galadriel responds that if the price is blood, then she will pay it. She is that craving character. She does not seem to think about much else than killing, slaying. No matter is it Sauron, is it orcs, trolls, or men. Halbrand steps in and asks for 3 days to reconsider Galadriel's demands, for she demanded that she was escorted on a ship to Middle-earth. Of course, Numenorians did not agree, but they are convinced to reconsider, and they give the Halbrand and Galadriel 3 days to stay on the island. But Galadriel is restricted to stay only on palace grounds. Then we cut to Isildur, Elendil's son, and we learn that he is a cadet in Sea Guard. He will soon join it. He is hearing some voices. We are yet to discover what those mean. We learn that he has a sister, and there is nothing really more than just exposition, except for one particular line, an exclamation that is often used by the sea gods. The sea is always right. And the same words we hear from Elendil when he talks to Queen Regent, and she asks him why did he brought Galadriel to Numenor, for it is close to a treason to do so. And Elendil responds, the sea is always right. I'd very much like to ask Elendil, doesn't he fight the sea during a storm? Doesn't he wouldn't he agree to build harbors to protect the ships and people from the rage of the sea? Wouldn't he fight a sea monster? And how does he know what the sea wants? Wasn't the will of the sea to kill Galadriel and Halbrand, and he was just brought to them by chance? Maybe he just does not follow sea's will. How does he know that? How can he determine it? How can he be so sure about the will of the sea? What is this motivation? What can we take from that? Wouldn't it be easier to say, I cannot leave any creature, be it elf or human, or on the open sea, to just die? It is not a Numenorian way. This would be so much better to say, to know, to follow. That would be a great rule to follow for Elendil. But his first words are just, the sea is always right. Later he says that he did what he thought to be most prudent. But it is not his first line of defense. After all, the queen gives him a quest. He gives him some sort of a sword, and he is assigned to guard Galadriel, to watch her and to prevent her from causing any trouble. Later, we learn that Galadriel escaped. We are told by the guards that are looking for her. We are not shown. It is another case of lost opportunity, of telling and not showing. Then we see Galadriel that is sneaking behind the guards, And then suddenly beside her appears Elendil. How did he find her? Was he waiting for her? Why didn't she notice him? We are getting used to those questions not being answered. Ever. Well, Elendil tells Galadriel that he has been assigned to be her guard, to watch if she does something unacceptable, and he is to prevent her from that. Galadriel responds that he should have never brought her to Numenor. She already forgot that her being brought to Numenor saved her life. And then, when Elendil does not step back and let her escape, she threatens to kill him. What a lovely character, what a kind woman. You know, some elves wouldn't even cut down a tree, but this one just wants to bathe in blood. Well, Elendil still does not step back. So Galadriel tells him, "Who are you even, you mortal? How dare you speak to me?" What an arrogant, full of disdain, prideful woman. How not to love her? Well, then Elendil makes her realize that not everybody in Numenor hates her, speaks to her in Elvish, and tells her that the Elven tongue is still spoken in the whole of Lore. So Galadriel immediately forgets everything that has happened, Elendil also, and they both go to the Hall of Lore, which is away from the capital. So they forget the order that restrained Galadriel from moving from the palace. Elendil is accused of treason for bringing her even to Numenor, and now he allows her to leave the restricted ground. But maybe it will be addressed later. Maybe. Well, we see them traveling to the Hall of Law, and then we get this strange scene, again in slow motion, with this joyful music. Galadriel is smiling, riding on a horse. This music tries to elevate this moment, but there is nothing meaningful when we are to relate to this character that just threatened Elendil, that just told him that he's now no one compared to mighty elf. How are we to connect with Galadriel in her joyful moment here, when she's such a unlikable, proudful, arrogant, blood-craving woman? How are we supposed to do that? Then we see Halbrand trying to get a job as a smith, but he's told that nobody can be a smith without a special badge. So then we see him at a tavern, speaking with some smiths. At first, they are suspicious of him, they are not welcoming, but he offers to buy them, or the whole tavern, a drink, or even few runs. He pays for it with money that he apparently has with him. We never learn how. An outcast from Southlands, who was for presumably weeks on the sea, who is a shipwreck, and now has enough money, Numenorian coins, to pay for the whole tavern to drink. But that works, and then when he's saying goodbye to the smiths that now treat him more friendly, he steals one of the badges that they have with them. What does he plan to do with it? He is a stranger. Everybody will recognize him, and if one of the smiths notices that he lost his badge and then sees a stranger that never had a chance to get this badge working as a smith. That's not a plan, that's just a way to get caught. And indeed, he is immediately stopped by the smiths. They beat him, but he responds in the same way, and it turns out that he can beat them all four of them, to the point that they are almost dead on the street. But one of them escapes, and soon Halbrand is caught by Númenórean guards. Later, we see Galadriel and Elendil in the Hall of Law. There, we make certain very interesting discoveries. The first one is that Galadriel finally sees what Sauron's sigil stands for, because she flips a page with this sigil. And, looking at the map, she sees the same shape. It is Southlands, the later lands of Mordor, that are represented on this sigil. So, are we to believe that for centuries of her hand, she haven't flipped any representation of this sigil even once? Or looking at it, she haven't noticed that it is a shape of mountains that surround a certain country? Well, but what is the meaning of the map that we see on this sigil? Why is it represented? We learn that in the Hall of Lore, because signed by the same sigil is a document from the war with Morgoth, where one of the spies from the Morgoth's dungeons has brought news. And there it is written that in the case of Morgoth's defeat, Sauron's power and all his forces is to be gathered in the said Southlands. So, for thousands of years, Númenóreans had this information, the enemy's plan, the proof that he will be active, and they haven't read it. For centuries, Galadriel hunted Sauron, and the news of this document reached there to her. It is quite understandable, but Númenóreans that were elven allies did not bring them the information. Haven't they read it? It is unbelievable that a report from enemy's dungeons would not be read. It is found very easily. The lore master brings it almost immediately, but seemingly nobody tried to read it. It is written in the Black Speech, but it does not change anything. It even makes it more important that this information is encrypted. So it is surely important, and nobody cared to read it. Only now Galadriel comes and discovers enemy's plan. But in order to make such stunning discovery, all Númenóreans, not this generation, but all generations of Númenóreans, all those who studied the law and documents, are belittled, are made just ignorant or stupid to not notice enemy's plans that were stored in the Hall of Law. And we should discuss also the fact that Sauron, by making this sigil and marking his traces, and Galadriel's brother, and many other, and leaving many other signs, leaves also a clue to his plan, points out where to find him. Of course, it is for the orcs, but that means that everybody could find him. But seemingly for thousands of years, nobody discovered what this sign means. It exemplifies just poor writing, poor solutions of the problems. In order to make payoff, and the writers make everybody seem ignorant and unintelligent. There are two more scenes and worth attention. The first one is Galadriel visiting Halbrand in prison, where she tells him that she discovered also, beside that the Southlands are in danger, that the pendant that Halbrand wears on his chest is a pendant of the kings of the Southlands. So she wants to forge an alliance with him to together fight the evil that gathers there. So she believes that he got this pendant as an heir to the throne of the Southlands. Maybe that's true, we don't know. And the second scene is Queen Regent talking to her father. We do not discover his name, but he is supposed to be named Tar Palantir. And she says that the Galadriel's arrival means that it has come to what they feared, that something that they feared has just begun. We don't know what they are talking about. Is there some sort of prophecy? But that's a storyline that will be explored later. So, what did we learn about the world? First thing is that hobbits live their own to death if they do not catch up with the others. The second one is that the orcs gather in Southlands and nobody notices them. Also, there is their leader named Ada. And we learn that elves are reluctant to cut down trees, but are not reluctant to cut down people. In Numenor, we learn that the official powers do not have sympathy for the elves, but there are some people who still love them. And there we also learn Sauron's plan to gather his forces in the Southlands, and that he marked his sigil with this plan, and everybody could discover it. And we also know now that Halbrand is assumed to be a descendant of a king of the Southlands. And now the characters. I don't think we can say anything new about Nori. And about Arondir, the most impactful moment for him was that his companion died and he had to cut down a tree. Now, Elendil. I think I like him the most, especially for that episode. Maybe it is because of the fact that he stood in the way of Galadriel and did not back down. He is true to his heart, and I'm interested to see how he will be developed later. Now Halbrand makes a stupid decision and ends up in prison, and there is something in his actions and words that makes him seem suspicious and two-faced. I guess we'll see where he will end up later. And now Galadriel. I lost all the scraps of sympathy I had left for her. She is arrogant, selfish, disdainful, ungrateful, demanding, and blood-craving. Also, she is suicidal. I said that in the previous episode, and now she admitted it herself. She said that she and Halbrand were certain to die on the open sea if Elendil did not rescue them. So she was even closer to death when she jumped off her own ship. She is a primary example of how not to introduce and present the protagonist. Well, it is not a way to present a protagonist. It is a way to present a villain. Don't believe me? Let's just switch some visuals.
Who is this mortal who speaks to me as if he has the slightest idea who I am?
Who is this mortal who speaks to me as if he has the slightest idea who I am?
Now, the question of being faithful to the source material. At the beginning I have some minor issues, for example, the orcs that do not use the black speech, even speaking between themselves, but it is the case with all languages that should be used in this series, that they are used occasionally, and there doesn't seem to be a good reason why they are used here and not used there. The second one is that Elendil invokes the name of good gods, while he should call the name of the Valar, but maybe he meant them, but it was not clear. And now something to praise. I liked, because it was faithful, the representation of Númenor and its history, the fact that the men that fought alongside the elves against Morgoth were given the Isle, and they lived there in peace. And also the fact that there was division between them after thousands of years, which seemingly now passed. There were the faithful, who believed in the friendship between men and elves, and there were the king's men, who were against it. Their name came from the kings, of course, who started this arrogance in which they refused to have any contacts with the elves, and they also rejected the Valar's commands. So it is well presented, but there are some questions that ignore and the original story. The first one is that we see the Queen Regent Tarmiriel. She never was a regent. She was a daughter of Palantir, one of the kings who changed his ways and wanted to repair the relations between Númenóreans and the elves, but in the end he failed, and after his death she never ascended to the throne. She was forced to marry a usurper, Ar-Pharazôn. So she never was a queen regent, and the fact that we even see her exemplifies the trouble with the timeline in the show. We get here, in the third episode, the first reliable source on which we can base our assumptions of what time is it in this world. Because Tarmiriel lived in the third millennium of the Second Age, over 1,000 years after the Rings of Power were created. Sauron, in her time, was a known threat, but here he's just discovered, and the Rings of Power are a future. We see Elendil, who is the king that lived, the king in Middle-earth, who lived almost to the end of the Second Age. So we do not have much time to present all that was not yet presented. And there is not enough time to present all that happened in thousands of years in just 1 century. Also, Elendil, here in this series, is not from the royal line as it was the case in the books, and it is a matter of grave importance, because Elendil came from the royal line He was an heir to Andunye. He was a prince of Númenóreans. He had rights to the throne if the ruling line would end. And he indeed was the High King of Arnor and Gondor, the realms in exile in Middle-earth. Because of that, his heirs, from which descends Aragorn, his heirs had the rights and were justified to rule the men because they came from the ruling line and from the royal line, and the right to rule was unchallenged. For they were descendants of Elros, Arondir, of Tuor and Idril, of Beren and Luthien. And the fact that it is now diminished, ignored, it is not used in this series, shows us that there is no respect for even the family of the characters, for what is to come. For Aragorn, one of the most important characters in the Lord of the Rings that apparently this show wants to be a part of, as we see in the title. And my problem is not that they dared to change anything or something rather from the source material, but that there seems to be not a reason for that. I do not see any advantage of changing the timeline and Elendil's family, for he is said to be just a noble, once great line, but he is not said to be what he was. And there is nothing that it achieves. Maybe we'll see something, but now there is nothing, and based on what we have seen, we can have serious doubts that there will be given any specific reason. I would happily accept the changes that make for a good story, but now there are none such changes. So, summing up, I'll ask you, what will be remembered from that episode? Any likable protagonists? Any meaningful deaths? Or maybe any surprising and reasonable revelations? Or maybe the opposite? Well, I hope to see you again very soon. Fare you well, Nova.
Subscribe right now, you little hobbitses.